Hello and welcome to the Tuesday afternoon radio show with your host, Randall Martin. And today, as always, we've got another great guest and a familiar voice. Today, we're going to revisit our interview with John Kirbow. He's here in the studio live, and we're going to talk about, and what I mean by revisit, I mean, we had several conversations with him last year. He's a veteran advocate and author, and we're going to have him back on the show today to talk about many pressing issues that are happening in the media and in culture society. John, how you doing?
Doing great, Randall. Always good to be on.
Hey, last year was a very trying year in many different ways. And this year seems to start off being actually no less complicated and trying. As a veterans advocate and author, how do you see sort of the landscape for people in terms of sort of their mental health and being able to navigate all of the social and sort of geopolitical issues that we're going through?
Right. Well, this touches on the book I just finished writing, which should be out January or February, called Veteran Mission Possible. It's taken my experience both as a veteran and as someone who studies a little bit about mental health struggles and pathways to both suicide ideation and intervention and how to connect through communities. I think mental health is vastly underappreciated in this country, but it's also becoming more recognized in recent years. And a huge part of it is being willing to admit where we're vulnerable, where you can be very well equipped in other areas of life, but having human vulnerabilities, seeking help and admitting, connecting with a solid community really helps. But I think there's a national aspect to this as well, in terms of constant bombardment to extreme positions on social media, the sensational news cycle, and geopolitical events, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, etc., being showcased in more up close and personal ways, which is both good because it kind of bridges an empathy gap and allows people to see the suffering and the need for addressing human suffering. But it also, I think the sensational nature of social media and mainstream media has kept people in a state of alertness. And our brain is hardwired by evolution to the sort of fight or flight tunnel vision where we just sort of react. And it keeps people, and hyperpolarization and political ideology tends to keep people in the state of alertness as well. And this has eroded our relationship with friends and neighbors through these forming political tribes where we talk past each other. And some of that is necessary when it comes to moral disagreement, but it's gone to an extreme where they talk past each other, and the fringes are being increasingly amplified. And people often have common ground where they can say, okay, we agree on the need, for example, prison reform, justice reform, whatever.
Right.
All they see is the most extreme caricature of the other side, left and right. So they think any talk of social justice or Black Lives Matter or gun ownership reflects only the most extreme caricature, instead of average people who could have a coffee and be like, actually, we agree on 80%. So I think we need to be no less passionate, but a little more discerning when it comes to that.
Well, I think, and you hit on the term that we were speaking about earlier, just sort of having empathy and understanding and a willingness to have somewhat of an open mind and learn in the conversation. So many people approach conversations where they have a definitive idea and they're only looking to express that idea. They're not willing to listen to any other ideas. And so these conversations invariably become non-productive because you're not really, each party is not really gaining any information. They're just trying to win a point. This kind of contentiousness, I know you've traveled, and in your life in the military, you worked a lot in psychological operations and dealing with the mind of soldiers, the mind of the enemy. How does all of this sort of conflict play into our adversaries around the world that look at the United States and notice these? Does this appear to be a vulnerability, all of this polarization?
Yeah, well, that's the other book I have, which should be, it's an ebook called Combating Domestic Extremism, but it talks about information warfare, psychological warfare, and how these, not just disinformation, but these polarization campaigns from Russia and others, for example, basically feed on one of our biggest vulnerabilities. And we are essentially become multipliers for this disinfo and propaganda, because one of our biggest vulnerabilities is not just our hyperpolarization, but our propensity to be locked in an echo chamber and the resistance to changing our mind when we're wrong and to just reacting. And you look at every area of life, from sports, combat sports, mixed martial arts, jujitsu, science, technology, innovation, business, every area of human evolution or progress comes from adaptability, being willing to learn and adapt, right? And I always talk about the Bruce Lee Jeet Kune Do analogy, right? Always adapt and don't be closed off to new information. The one area where we're consistently closed off the most is politics, and you could say religion too, but mainly ideology as an umbrella. And so that keeps people locked in these echo chambers. The algorithms feed them into increasingly radicalized pipelines and expose them to more and more similar information. People have heard this a million times. But also, the loudest and most extreme voices tend to speak the most and drown out sensible conversation. And I see this in everything from men's rights and red pill spaces and feminist spaces to, race relations to police reform. I mean, you could go issue by issue, Israel-Palestine, obviously, where some of the most sensational, bigoted, extreme, crazy voices tend to drown out sensible discussion. And those are amplified by these disinformation campaigns. So information warfare operatives understand what their objectives are, which could be to divide, break apart the NATO alliance, weaken American democracy, support one candidate over another, whatever it is. But they then analyze the target audience. What are their vulnerabilities? Where can we mess with them? Where can we manipulate them? What are the pressure points? And these are some of our biggest pressure points, is the hyperpolarization and being inside our echo chambers and this instinctive, visceral reaction we have to hearing something we disagree with. But also the empathy thing is important, because the psychological nature of empathy, you look at the neuroscience of how we evolved, and the empathy neurons in the brain, they're often called mirror neurons, where you invoke what people could call moral imagination. What's it like to be the other person? The problem is empathy is really good, but it can also be weaponized against the out-group. What I mean by that is people tend to bond together against an in-group. And moral emotions, people talk about moral psychology. There's the work of people like Jonathan Haidt and others that study the psychology of moral emotions, where morality and a sense of being right tends to bond people together as an in-group, but it blinds them to the out-group. And this can lead to less empathy for the out-group and more empathy for your own in-group. We see this with Israel. Palestine's a perfect example. But you can
does this go along with sort of tribalism?
Yes, it is. It is a fundamental aspect of human tribalism when it comes to selective empathy. Now, we can, through altruistic compassion, through cultivating more mindfulness, and empathy could be developed like anything else, just like you can develop a skill set in, a golf swing. I mean, you can become more empathetic and compassionate. So people like Peter Singer and others talk about, these are people in the social sciences that talk about the evolution of moral progress. Steven Pinker, people like that. There's the concept of expanding moral circles, or moral circle of inclusion, meaning, back in the days of the 1800s, the in-group was, white males. Then they said, okay, maybe we should expand this circle of empathy more and more and more. And look where we are today, 150, 200 years later. We've expanded that moral circle enormously, but there's still empathy gaps. So now the idea of slavery or segregation is unthinkable to most people. But there's still areas where inequality and suffering exist and oppression exists that we need to address. So we're always expanding that moral circle. So vegans talk about that with, don't eat animals. And I'm not the poster child for this, because I
right. Right.
That's an example of continually expanding the moral circle even more.
Well, is social media, in a way, even though people are not isolated and they're talking to each other, you don't see a lot of empathy that plays out in the social media. And in fact, no. I think a lot of people are their worst selves.
They are.
And they don't think about, how these comments affect the other person.
Yeah, I've been in so many spaces on the left and the right both, where I really am genuinely trying to have a good faith conversation and extend an olive branch. And the way it's taken me years to emotionally acclimate to this. I've been blown away and fundamentally confused by why people talk this way on social media, like the way people interact. It got me thinking one day, do these people actually talk like this with other human beings? Like if they were sitting in a pub and they met me in person, and we had the same conversation, would they actually talk this way? And there's no way they would. They don't. Both in terms of courtesy, but also because you see someone face to face, you're more likely to be, to feel some common ground. But it's like Mike Tyson said, people feel way too comfortable disrespecting people on social media. No one's going to get punched in the face. Not that we should use violence, but the point is the way most people, the keyboard warriors, interact is so fundamentally different than the way they talk in real life. And if
how come there isn't more civility online? Is it the fact that, again, there's no repercussions to being rude and disrespectful?
Part of it's also suffering. Like a lot of people that lack empathy for people they consider out groups, they say like they a lot of that is their empathy for their in group. So suffering and empathy for your own group, your own, you could say your circle of inclusion, for yourself and your family. If you're struggling economically, if you feel abandoned, left behind, neglected, you could feel, or if you're oppressed in some way, you could feel less empathy for people you consider political rivals. Like, I've been suffering, so screw people who don't. If they're not going to help me, I'm not going to help them. So it can widen the empathy gap even more.
So does that then a perceived justification for this aggressive behavior and intolerance for others? Is that, well, I've had my own problems and, I've gone through this, therefore, instead of creating what you would think would be an automatic empathy, saying, if I've gone through this and it didn't make me feel good, then why would I put it out there?
Absolutely.
The exact opposite is happening. He said, I've gone through this, so therefore I'm going to reflect it onto you, even though I know it's a bad thing.
Right. And some people gravitate more toward that egalitarianism, whereas some people see justice more as fairness, where like, if I have to work to pay off my college, then, I'll be damned if these Zoomers are going to get student loans paid off or something. Whereas other people might say, I don't want them to suffer the way I suffered, and I'd be happy for them if they didn't have to go through the economic struggle I went through. These are two fundamentally different ways of approaching empathy. Now, to be fair, there is some level where you want people to struggle just enough to build character and not get everything
right.
That's reasonable. Like, I don't expect someone who struggled their whole life as a working class person to want their tax dollars to pay off every single $250,000 student loan of people who went to NYU. Like, I get that. Generally speaking, I see this a lot in spaces because I'm working on another book about the whole red pill and masculinity and the void a lot of men have, and filling that with better answers so they won't gravitate toward, like the fact that, Andrew Tate's filling the void a lot of men have, because we as a society are not addressing that vulnerability that a lot of the questions of identity and masculinity and confusion with gender, sexual dynamics. So in writing a book on that, I've been spending a lot of time in these feminists and red pill spaces both. And what you see very often is this complete lack of empathy, especially among the men's spaces, total lack of empathy for the opposite gender or the opposite sex, like saying, well, I was screwed over by, I was hurt by a woman, so therefore I don't have empathy for, they don't say it directly, but you see this widening empathy gap where people vilify an entire group because of what they went through. So that empathy for them and people like them can make them less sympathetic to the suffering of the opposite sex. And you see this across a lot of our conversational landscape, across a lot of issues.
Now, clinically, would you call a lack of empathy, that's a person who has a lack of empathy, is termed as a psychopath?
If it's a clinical, there's a debate about psychopath versus sociopath, nature versus nurture, or a combination.
Right.
But the idea is that a psychopath / sociopath tend to lack the mirror neurons that are generated in, I believe it's been a few years since I've really done deep dives into the neuroscience of empathy. I believe it might be the hippocampus or somewhere. There's a number of parts of the brain. And there's a book called The Psychopath Whisperer, which talks about deep dives into the neuroscientific studies of and fMRI and different brain scans of psychopaths. And they basically, most psychopaths are not bad people. They just lack the right brain wiring to cultivate the kind of feelings of empathy that we have. Now, a lot of them can be aware of this, and they say, okay, I realize I'm like Data in Star Trek. I don't have my emotional chip fully engaged. Like, they still have emotions, but they don't feel the same empathy that we do. But they realize they can still know right from wrong. They can still act like a normal person. So most psychopaths aren't going out slicing people up in their basement or charming men in sport coats murdering women. Like that's the
Right,
stereotype.
right. The violence aspect is different.
That's an extreme. I mean, people, that's like Joe Goldberg from You. That's an extreme. That does exist, but
Right.
you know, there are bad, but most psychopaths are not. I mean, there are a lot. There are like, I'm not saying they're all mostly good or bad. I'm saying like it's a spectrum. But yeah.
But as a society, I feel like we're moving closer to that spectrum as a group, because when you're so polarized and isolated in thought and act in silos, as you say, it's so easy then to other the other people, and then justify your own actions and perpetuate a sort of movement of not caring and negating and marginalizing people that don't agree with you. And then you can never achieve that common ground that's necessary for, a group to function. Like, everyone's going to feel differently, about different things, but we're trying in some ways to move to groups that, if you don't believe my ideology, if you're not 100% supportive of me, then you don't count.
Well, that moral purity is a huge problem on both the left and the right. It really is. It's isolating a lot of people that could be good allies in a cause. And it's also extremely unrealistic. Most people are just not going to be 100. Like, most people that try to push this this sort of extreme ideological purity, ironically, comprise a relative fringe of the population. Like most people on the left or the right that are extremely purist and fundamentalist in their views don't actually reflect most Americans or most people on either side. So a dirty little secret, I think I've told you this, is that most people I know that are progressives, and I do consider myself progressive in some ways, are not necessarily the extreme left caricature the right makes them out to be. In fact, they won't say this publicly, but a lot of them privately will tell you they're tired of the fundamentalism and dogmatism and intolerance within a certain wing of the left. They're not against the progressive values. They're against the extreme narrow binary lens where everything's black and white, oppressor, oppressed, to the point where you dehumanize individuals by lumping them into a collective. Like, there is oppression that's real. There's systemic ways to study unequal structures. But when you lump everybody, when you group everybody into this binary all or nothing category of you're an oppressor, therefore you don't deserve empathy, we're oppressed, therefore we can't be wrong, we can't be criticized. The problem there isn't the progressive views. It's the fundamentalist way of thinking. It's a style of thinking. And the conservative side of it is crazy.
Well, as you say, it's a lazy and unrealistic style of thinking, because, no one ever fits into those categories. No one's all of something or not, or has no qualities of other. So you have to understand the nuances of who you're dealing with in order to really solve a problem. But why is it? Again, you study history, you study conflict. Why is it that people are willing to accept these very simplistic and unrealistic, inaccurate portrayals of people in the pursuit of maybe being efficient for trying to navigate the human landscape?
It's like, I think it's the fallacy that being louder and more angry makes you better at fighting. It doesn't. It literally doesn't. It's stupid. It doesn't make sense. It's this idea that being more puritanical, more like a Pharisee, more of a fundamentalist somehow makes you more morally pure. It makes you a better person, or it makes you more, it makes you somehow morally superior. And that's just a complete fallacy. Genuine concern, genuine compassion, genuine desire for a cause will lead you to want to know when you're wrong, to want to know the best pathway to solve the problem, how to reach more people effectively through communication, through emotionally effective communication. So this binary all or nothing thinking, and there's examples we talk about on the right as well, where they try to, if you're anywhere, like Ronald Reagan would be excoriated as a liberal and kicked out of the party today. He Nixon, people like that would be looked at as crazy Marxist liberals by a lot of modern Republicans that live in their own bubble. I'm not saying that to insult every Republican, but I mean, when I was growing up in Georgia, being a conservative or a Republican was like enormously more moderate than it is today. Things have shifted, but people siloed in their own fundamentalist sort of tunnel vision of what the political axis is. So I think this fallacy, this happens a lot within social justice movements too on the left, where people conflate fundamentalist, rigid thinking with moral sincerity. That if you're more
Right.
extreme, you're somehow more, that means you're more sincere. And that's complete bullshit. It's just absolutely wrong. And I've had this leveled at me a number of times across the, divide when it comes to Puritans attacking me. And the thing is, most people on the left or the right are not these extremes. But the extremes tend to think they're the gatekeepers, they're the vanguard, they're the default guardians of the left and right limits of how things work. And they conflate their own extreme, like tunnel vision and unwillingness to ever change their mind with moral character. And this is one of the biggest fallacies our country is making today. And
in that philosophy, are we not legitimizing this narrow form of thinking that is, again, unrealistic, but we're saying now it's legitimate because it represents my pure view without any exceptions. And since we've talked about or started to enter into the political world here, and we're talking about the Republicans, and I find in many conversations in years past, I mean, maybe going back a decade, you would find that some of the disagreements tended to be, tax and spend, or what social programs that people were for, or the deficit were these issues. Now it seems like those are not the issues at all. As you said, Reagan would be regarded as a liberal, and before he was the ultimate hero. Fiscal, what's the right word? Fiscal integrity and all those other buzz were the sort of party mainstays. Now none of that is, not only is none of that really even talked about, but now there is a complete denial of the truth. Morality. I mean, we looked at when Nixon was impeached, right, and the things that he did decades ago. That is pales in comparison to what we've seen happen and been proven, and yet that hasn't moved the needle at all. Like, all what's acceptable now in terms of lack of presidential, even public decorum or civility has slid so much. How did this happen in the maybe, let's say, in the case of a decade, in the course of a decade? How did we end up here?
Well, this is weird because when people study the science of polarization, or the political science of you could start with Congress in 1994, Newt Gingrich's contract with America, where people used to go to the Hay Adams Hotel or the bar and talk about their mistresses and drink some cocktails, smoke a cigar with the rival party. And then in the mid 90s, it sort of shifted to this binary sort of team sport of us versus you, where, there's always some oppositional dynamics there, but it became more of a hostile sort of adversarial, my team versus your team, we're good, you're bad, to the point where people stopped communicating with each other and fostering these bonds of conversation. And it led, and you can actually literally map this out through social network analysis, which is an awesome tool we use in Iraq and Afghanistan to look at insurgent networks and how we can disrupt everything from nodes on telephones to who's talking to who and who's in whose network. But they've actually created maps which you can display. You could see these maps on, if you look at polarization graphics, you actually look at red and blue across the circle and how much they interact, and you see the increasing polarization and how it dramatically contrasts to what it used to be decades ago. And I think a lot of it's been exacerbated by social media. It's not the cause, but it's an amplifier where people are falling into echo chambers and exposed to the most extreme opinion. And social media attracts people who like arguing just for the sake of arguing, and gets people in that their brains in that survival mode where they just sort of react. And I think that's all. And then there's the disinformation campaigns from overseas, which again don't cause it, but they amplify it. We are our own biggest vulnerability. But I think it's, obviously the election of Obama sort of drew out a lot of the pre-existing racism. And I'm not saying every criticism of Obama is racist, obviously, but there is a segment of the population that did sort of reveal their true colors. And then I think it was
absolutely. I mean, it was often said that. I mean, that was the first time that I heard in the presidentials for Congress to say, outright, whatever you want to do, we're going to block. Whatever it is that you're for, we are against. Just by definition, if you are for it, we are absolutely 100% against it.
Ridiculous. That was basically throwing the country under the bus and saying your best interest is not about what's best for you as an American, as a voter, as a human being. It's not about data, about scientific, feedback, about data-driven policy. It's about team sport, which is a complete betrayal of their sacred duty, which is weird. When you join the military, you raise your right hand, you swear to support and defend the United States against, it's sacred. That duty's sacred. And I'm like, do these people not take an oath? Do they literally believe they're doing this based on helping voters? Or are they too stupid, or they do mental gymnastics and rationalize it away? Do you really think your side's right 100%? There's no way they believe that. So what really the big defining moment for me was 2006 and then 2007. This is after my second Iraq deployment. I saw how decisions about the troop surge were being made not based on the lives of soldiers or the future of the Iraqi people and the lives of the Iraqi people, all of which are extremely important. It wasn't about the stability of that region. It was about, or proxy wars between Shia Sunni extremist groups. It was about what party you belong to. Most of that vote on the surge was split evenly down party lines for the most part, which means they literally cared about party lines, which has nothing to do with the surge. What does being a Democrat or Republican, red or blue, have anything to do with the best decision for Iraq? That's not how you that's not how a decision process works. That's not how decision making works. Like, your party should have nothing to do with what's best for the soldier and the Iraqis, right? And the stability of that region. That shouldn't factor in. And yet that vote was split along party lines. That's where I realized that our partisan system cares more about team sport than the lives of soldiers and the lives of the Iraqi people and the stability of an entire region. Right. That really hit home with me.
Well, is there a way now to, bring back to center? Is there a way to reverse that trend? Obviously, that's problematic. And that schism seems as if it's this widening gulf that seems unreconcilable.
Right.
Except if you have a common enemy. Often it's said, if you have a common enemy that attacks a group, the group will unite to fight off that other enemy.
Right. But we need to be invaded by the aliens from Independence Day to bring us.
Is that what it's going to take? I don't know.
Half the country would be like, no, they're not real. It's all the deep state, when people say center, this is a fallacy people make. They think that if you reject extremes, that you're somehow saying both sides are equal and you have to be directly in the center. And this drives me nuts. Like, over the years, this really, really bothers me. And I've had to learn to tactically refine my language for clarity to show people, no, you don't have to be right in the middle. You can be where you are. You can be true to your principles. Just drop the fundamentalist binary thinking and the zero-sum fallacies and be more open to being wrong. Being willing to be wrong is the.
Well, that's how you learn. I mean, that's how you learn through exchange of an idea, not just reciting your own ideas. Well, you know what? This is a great place to take a quick pause and a station ID. You're listening to WGXZ, a listener supported radio 90.7, and this is the Tuesday afternoon radio show with your host, Randall Martin. And I've got the great John Kirbow, veterans advocate and author, are with us today, and we're going to continue this conversation. We're going to take a quick tune, and then we'll be right back at it. Don't go anywhere. Thank you. Hello and welcome back to the Tuesday afternoon radio show with your host, Randall Martin. And again, we are having a wonderful conversation with the great John Kirbow. He is a veterans. Let me see if I can say it right. Veterans advocate and author. And he's honest with us today. And we're talking about a variety of different issues. And I think, John, we spoke about another issue, which is in the lines of communication, and it was about how people can have conversations about geopolitical issues like the Palestine-Israel issue, or conflict, I should say, and have healthy thought exchanging conversations that don't that are fruitful. And I think that you had some ideas and techniques for ways that these conversations can be had, which I think will be helpful.
Yeah. Well, our inability to even talk about this issue fruitfully and have basic moral boundaries of what is and is not acceptable. For example, it should be categorically unacceptable for Jews and others in Israel to be mass murdered or mass displaced. That should not even be on the table. The same thing should be said about the current status quo of Palestinian suffering, not just the horrible, suffering for the bombings, but the way Palestinians live. That is not sustainable morally or practically. I think what people don't do is they fail to draw basic moral boundaries. So when someone says the word from the river to the sea, which has different meanings, and I'm going to go into this in a little bit about what I call Schrodinger's resistance, which is, I'll explain that, Schrodinger's cat. It's a joke about where something is both true and not true at the same time. There's a lot of there's a lot of Free Palestine narratives that really are talking about a peaceful resolution where Jews and Israelis and Palestinians can live together from the river to the sea in a single secular, democratic, pluralistic Palestinian state, right? That would be the ideal. Whereas others, when they say river to the sea, they mean actually displace the Jews. I mean, that's the continuum. It's a spectrum. And when and in a lot of these protests, you hear that phrase, and you hear a lot of phrase like other phrases and chants, and they could have double meanings. Some people could mean it peacefully, in terms of, well, maybe the resistance is justified, but in the end, we don't want to displace the Israelis. We want everyone to live together. Whereas other people could mean, kick them out and, mass displacement, even genocide, right? So people too, the confusion is people don't set moral boundaries, and people who, the people who mean river to the sea peacefully tend not to condemn the ones who mean it violently. And the people who are seeking a peaceful resolution of coexistence often fail to condemn those who actually are talking about expelling the Jews. So, and this goes the other way too. There's a lot of people that are pro-Israel. I mean, the word is subjective. You could be pro-Israel and pro-Palestine in the basic sense of wanting Israel to be secure and safe, and that Jews there have a right to exist, which I support. And you could say, well, it should be within 1948 boundaries or 67 boundaries. But pro-Israel could mean the basics of security, safety, and the right to exist. Whereas and pro-Palestine could mean they have a right to be free and to be safe and to have their own state as well. I also support that. But there's people on the pro-Israel side that often ignore extremism and genocidal narratives against the Palestinians. And this is why we need moral boundaries. And we also need tactical clarity. What that means is being clear about what you do and don't support. And that is so rare when people talk about this. When I look at pro-Israel or pro-Palestine people on social media, I rarely know where they're coming from, what their moral boundaries are, or what they're willing to condemn. Because most people on either side there's not enough people willing to draw a boundary and condemn the fanatics and the pro-violent, the people that support mass violence against the other group. So a lot of these Free Palestine protests, they're not clear on where they draw the line. They'll say, no, it's racist to say that we're trying to expel the Jews. That's stereotyping. But then there are people within these exact groups, literally I see it every single time. I'm not even exaggerating. Every time when there's a thread about this, there's always people in there that say resistance by any means necessary. October 7th was justified. One state, expel them all. Like there are people, it's not most. Most people fighting for Palestine are not saying this. But there's always that extremism in these same threads. And I'll tell people, hey, you have people in this thread right here literally saying river to the sea means kick out the Jews. Are you going to condemn this? They usually don't. So I'm like, what am I supposed to believe you actually support? That feeds into the narrative of Netanyahu and Israel's far right, creating a zero-sum fallacy that frames support for Palestine as an existential threat against Israel, which hurts Palestinians. People need to learn this.
Right. But it's a nuanced argument, and you have to take, if you're going to be a proponent of peace and safety and fairness and equity, then you have to look at both sides. But you do have to draw the line to say murder and terrorism is, a non sequitur. I mean, that's just not acceptable. It's a line
Right.
that you don't cross. There is resistance. You can have social, you can have resistance, you can have demonstrations. Certainly, that's what happened in the United States, where we had a variety of different types of resistance against colonization, against oppression, against racism, against apartheid. There are ways to do that, but I think once you cross the line of terroristically murdering people in this way, you set up a scenario where it's hard to have then any conversation.
It is.
And then you just now are devolved into conflict that now is going to be a perpetual thing. And I think one of the unusual things about this conflict is in the scope of the ideology of the Palestinians to say they want to be free, and which is completely justified. Absolutely. And they want to have an equal, and they want their land back. All of these things are conversations that have to be had. But I think in the tactic, when I looked at this, and I even talk about, and I've compared and contrasted to civil rights here in the United States. But when you look at the tactic of saying, I'm going to attack the enemy group, but then I'm going to go back and hide amongst the non-combatants, and use those potentially as shields, so that in order to attack me, you have to go through them. That just seems to be sort of a heinous approach to trying to achieve the stated goal of civil rights, or civil rights,
inclusive human rights. Absolutely,
human rights.
I through my time in Iraq, especially as an Arabic-speaking PSYOP soldier, I was absolutely blown. It was beyond shocking to see the level of dehumanization that insurgent and terrorist groups have toward the local population. People really, truly do not get this. They fund most civilians, most people who've never been deeply involved in insurgency in the Middle East or in most parts of the world. They truly don't understand how fundamentally dangerous and horrible these groups are, and the way they will absolutely hurt the local population. And a big example is when I was there in Iraq, they call them terrorists and foreign fighters. Basically, Al Qaeda came over the Syrian border, and they would bomb. They took out a mosque in Samarra. It was a holy Shia mosque, the Al-Askari Shrine, which is one of the sacred imams within Shia Islam. It almost started it didn't quite devolve to civil war, but it started a huge conflict where hundreds of people a day were dying. Bodies were being cleared out of the streets. They had to set a curfew that turned it into a ghost town when we'd be out on patrols. And most Iraqis were horrified, Shia and Sunni alike. It actually almost unified them to an extent as well. Despite it was dividing them, but it also unified a lot of people because they saw how horrific these terrorists and insurgents were and their willingness to make the population suffer. This does not change no matter how many times a group like Hamas tries to mirror social justice narratives about anti-colonialism and oppression and justice, all of which are legitimate grievances. There are legit grievances Palestinians have, and colonialism and oppression are real. But Hamas very cleverly knows how to mirror back the language of social justice and progressive values to try to reframe their narrative and use that as a smokescreen for their militant aims. They are not about equality. They are not about freedom. Calling these people are not about freedom any more than Gene Simmons is about sexual abstinence. It is a fundamental fallacy to believe that. It makes no sense. But this goes back to like Said Qutb, who wrote Milestones about, and I encourage people to read that. It very cleverly makes a lot of very valid points about talking about the good parts of Western values and the good parts of Islam. And it sounds very reasonable and ropes you in and speaks the language of the Western scholar. The Ayatollah Khamenei's book about this, it was the jurist, I'm forgetting the name of it, but it basically was about Islamic jurisprudence, Valiyat al-Faqih, which is like the state of the jurist, basically an Islamic theocracy, Islamic jurisprudence, right? I forgot the exact name of the book, but I read it years ago, and I'm like, this is really well written, and it really does sound reasonable at first, and then it slowly uses that as a smokescreen for
Mhm.
promoting a theocracy, which is forcing your religion, a fundamentalist, narrow interpretation of Islam, on the population. Hamas is not a justice progressive, it is not a peaceful group. It really fundamentally is a rigid militant theocracy that would absolutely throw women, homosexuals, dissidents, even many Muslims who are not willing to comply, that will always create more suffering in the local population.
Well, this is one of the things that is often forgotten, that in this October 7th attack, there were many people attacked other than Israelis. They were Ethiopian cab drivers. There were all sorts of people that were murdered, just murdered in this scenario. What is it that the mind of a terrorist, what's the aim? What are people are trying to achieve? I mean, we know that the operative words, if you break down the word, is to create an atmosphere or an environment of terror. But what do you perceive the objective of something like this is?
Well, the book definition varies. It's basically the unlawful or threatened use of force or violence against individuals or property to coerce or intimidate governments or societies, usually in line with political, religious, or ideological objectives. So, short answer, it means using terror and fear and or violence to intimidate a society to get your way based on your belief system. That's the idea of terrorist. That's why when you watch Die Hard, Hans Gruber was not really a terrorist. He actually was a bank robber, pretending to be like a Red Army terrorist or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's basically attacked. The idea is that it's seen as a way to even out an asymmetry in power. A conventional military force can easily overmatch a small insurgent organization. So terrorism, including hostage taking, is seen as a way to even out the asymmetry. And in unconventional or irregular warfare, we call it, or asymmetric warfare, it's about different disparity in military capabilities leads to outside the box thinking and tactics. Cyber warfare, disinformation, psyop propaganda, small unit tactics through decentralized cells, support by host nation proxy groups like Hezbollah, Iran, etc. But also, I mean, Hamas basically has more tunnels than all Super Mario games combined, and they're literally amateur rocket scientists. I mean, they have developed an enormous, and they're also a formal organization. They're not just insurgents; they're the government right now, at least of Gaza and arguably, other areas too. But the point is, they basically, insurgency is defined by being very adaptive, just like in evolution. It's about adaptability, and they get very good at understanding how to coerce people through things like hostage taking. The point of like these Israeli hostages are being used as bargaining chips because they know that mainstream democratic societies, and people argue if Israel's democratic or not. I'm not trying to get into that, but I'm saying they know that the value of human life has an enormous amount of persuasive power. But so they use that as a way to even out the asymmetry. Now, here's the thing, though. When people promote terror, like when people say all resistance is justified, Palestine doesn't have the ability to fight Israel directly, so the only choice they have is for Hamas to engage in this kind of terrorism, right? They say by any means necessary. The thing is, promoting terrorism is actually not an effective tactic to help the Palestinian people. It's made incrementally over the decades, categorically by any measure, made their lives worse, their freedom, their access to resources, the loss of human life. And it doesn't stand a chance at unseating Israel militarily. It really doesn't. I mean, worst case, they would lead to a global conflict with surrogate nuclear weapons or something. This would just make life miserable for everybody. It is not a rational way to achieve their goal. It really isn't. It's not going to work. I mean, you could say that it'll raise enough awareness to force a negotiation, but that makes the point that negotiation is the better route. And if you had an alternate universe where there was a willingness to try to engage in a two-state solution, and then hopefully use that breathing space for the Palestinians to develop their own democratic institutions and to try to evolve. And they really have not had the opportunity to do that. They've been living in horrible and miserating conditions for decades, for generations. But if they had the opportunity to cultivate their own bottom-up, locally led democratic society that was secular, pluralistic, and by secular, I don't mean unreligious, but not a theocracy, not fanatical, right? Then you could have a conversation about saying, all right, what if we incrementally move toward a single Palestine where people live from the river to the sea and drink tea together, right? Like you can't get there without the precondition of having a democratic society in Palestine first. How can you go from Hamas, where they are now, to Israelis voluntarily allowing themselves to live in a one state with a group like Hamas, in charge, or having like how are they willing to? They basically be surrendering their very lives and autonomy, risking mass displacement or worse, in a current one state. You can't go directly into a one state right now.
Right.
Risk. It doesn't make sense.
Right. And the solution has to obviously include peace and security for both sides.
That's a precondition.
And so, like, when we talk about how do you have constructive conversations, all the rest, all the vitriol doesn't go any further in solving the issue of how do you achieve peace and security and autonomy, on both sides. And as you rightly pointed out, terrorism in either format doesn't work. Right. And so we are actually, I can't believe we're actually coming to a close in our time in this final hour of our broadcast. And it's always such a pleasure to talk to you, to hear your insights and your perspectives on society, culture, warfare, the military. Tell me again, where your books and your publication that you have. I know you have a new Substack. Let's talk about this. We only have a couple of minutes left, so let's get into it.
Sure. Well, I'm still just now setting up the Substack. I think and this is going to sound a bit amateur because I should know my Substack right now. I think it's John Kirbow Substack or something like that.
That sounds about right. That's usually they set up. And what's the name of your books?
Well, luckily my name's pretty rare, so it shouldn't be too hard to look up. The veteran book, which should be out in January or February, is called Veteran Mission Possible, and that's named after an organization, a collaborative effort among people and everything from healthcare to AI to using AI to understand suicide ideation, various veteran causes, phone apps. There's a lot of really awesome groups working in this collaborative space to create an incubator to combat not just veteran suicide and promote mental health, but look at wider solutions for society. Because if we can't help our vets, how are we going to fix the social ills in this country? So it talks about homelessness, safety nets,
yes, indeed,
a wide range of things for both veterans, and using that as an incubator to unleash more social innovation and really help this country to scale, how to scale up solutions.
Right.
And the other book, which is going to be on Amazon as soon as I finish the formatting, it's called Combating Domestic Extremism. And it's about understanding domestic terror and extremism and polarization and psychological warfare from my perspective, from a war zone perspective, and taking what I learned from PSYOP and working, looking at lessons from village stability, civil affairs, things like that, and applying it to extremism and polarization in America. Basically, groups that want civil war, radicalization through QAnon, how our brains are vulnerable to different conspiracies, and also how veterans are being weaponized and how veterans can come together to create a better counter narrative against extremism and reclaim what it means to be a patriot. So that's what the book Combating Domestic Extremism is about.
Well, this is all certainly information and themes that we need to have talked about, and that we need to have out there, in the marketplace of ideas, so that people can really understand from a veteran's perspective what's going on. John, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I'm sure we'll be talking to you again. I'll have your links to your site and to your publications available. You can check this radio station. I'll have them up. And thank you again. And thank you, listeners. This is WGXC 90.7 listener supported radio for open ears. And thank you for listening to this Tuesday afternoon radio show with your host, Randall Martin. And we will see you next week. Thanks again, John.
Thanks, man. Always a pleasure.